Silas Harrington kept his gloves on, even when the sun warmed the boards of the corral fence, even when the other hands peeled theirs off and shoved them into back pockets like the day had no teeth. Folks in Hawthorne Ridge had noticed plenty of small habits in their time, but that one stuck, because it wasn't about the weather. It was about hiding something. Eliza had noticed it first, years ago, the way a person notices a familiar sound in the dark. A creak, a breath, a truth that never announces itself, only waits to be seen. This morning, she watched him from the porch of the ranch house with a coffee cup she'd already forgotten to drink. He leaned over the gate, quiet as ever, and rested his forearms on the top rail as if he belonged there. As if he'd always belonged. That was the trouble with Silas. He could stand in the same place every day and still feel like a question no one had the courage to ask. Eliza set the cup down and forced herself to look away before Mrs. Tilda Bragg, who ran the house like a stern church hymn, caught her staring again. Tilda never said the word staring, of course. She'd say watching, like it was something Eliza ought to be ashamed of. "You'll make your eggs go cold," Tilda called from inside. It wasn't unkind. It was practical. Hawthorne Ridge was built on practicality. Eliza stepped back into the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat at the table as if her thoughts weren't still out at the corral with Silas. The eggs tasted like nothing. The coffee tasted like heat. Her heart tasted like a habit she couldn't break. If anyone asked, she would have said Silas was just another hand who'd stayed on longer than most. A steady worker. A man who didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't brag. The kind of man older folks approved of because they couldn't find anything in him to complain about. But Eliza knew the truth that sat beneath all that steadiness. She had loved him for years. Not loudly, not with dramatic confessions or tearful letters tucked into pockets. She'd loved him the way the prairie loves the fence line, quietly, constantly, and with a patience that could fool you into thinking it wasn't love at all. And she had refused him, again and again, without ever saying the real reason, because she was certain, down to her bones, that he did not want her back. It wasn't a guess she'd made for sport. It was something she'd learned in the slow, humiliating ways pride teaches. Silas spoke to everyone like they mattered, but he looked at Eliza like she was made of glass. Something precious, maybe, but too easy to break. He kept his distance in the doorway. He stepped aside when she passed. He answered her politely and left the air between them untouched. A man doesn't do that if he's longing, she'd told herself. A man does that when he's trying to be kind. Outside, a horse snorted. A bucket clanked. The day moved on, careless of what Eliza carried. After breakfast, she took folded linens out to the line, the wind snapping them like flags. Hawthorne Ridge sat up against the rise where the pines began, the town itself visible in the distance if you climbed the right hill. One main street, 2 churches, and a scattering of businesses that survived on hard work and harder winters. She pinned a sheet, then another, the cloth tugging against her fingers. A shadow crossed the ground behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You've got it set too low," Silas said. His voice always surprised her, not because it was harsh, but because it was gentle in a way that made her feel seen, and then immediately made her feel foolish for wanting more of it. She kept her eyes on the clothespin. "It's fine. It'll drag if the wind drops." "Eliza," he added softly, like her name mattered. That one word did something sharp to her ribs. She swallowed. "I'll raise it." Silas stepped closer. Not too close. He never got too close. He reached past her with careful manners, as if he was helping a stranger, instead of the only person in the world who could make his hands shake. His glove brushed the back of her knuckles. A single touch, brief as a blink, and yet her whole body reacted like a struck match. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Silas froze, just for a moment. His posture changed the way a man's does when he realizes he's stepped on something delicate. "I didn't mean," he started. "You didn't do anything." Eliza cut in too quickly, too sharp. She hated herself for it the second it left her mouth. Silas nodded once, a small motion that pretended not to hurt. "All right." He lifted the line anyway, steadying it with a strength that made the work look easy. Eliza stood there with clothespins between her fingers, unable to breathe the same way she had before he spoke her name. When he finished, he stepped back, gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "There," he said. "That ought to hold." "Thank you." Silas hesitated, as if there was another sentence in him fighting to be born. Eliza waited, against all her better judgment, for him to say something that would undo years of quiet. But he only nodded again. "I'll be in the south pasture." And then he was gone, leaving her with the flapping linens and the feeling that she'd missed something she couldn't name. That evening, the ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, and Eliza ate with Tilda and Mr. Bragg at the main table. Mr. Bragg spoke about feed prices and the creek running low. Tilda complained about dust on the windowsill, as if dust were a personal insult. Eliza nodded at the right places, but her mind kept returning to the moment Silas had said her name. Eliza. Not Miss Bragg. Not ma'am. Not nothing. After supper, she carried a lantern out back to the pantry shed, looking for a jar of peaches Tilda insisted had been misplaced. The sky was the color of cooled iron. The wind had quieted, leaving the world in a hush that made every footstep sound like a confession. She found the jar, cradled it against her chest, and turned, and nearly collided with Silas in the doorway. He was holding something in his left hand, a small tin box, scuffed and plain, no larger than a Bible. Eliza had seen it before, but never this close. He kept it hidden in his trunk, brought it out only when he thought no one was watching. Now it was in the lantern light, and she felt her pulse jump. Silas looked startled, as if he'd been caught mid-thought. His eyes flicked to the jar in her arms, then back to her face. "You're out late," he said. "So are you." Eliza heard the tremble in her own voice and hated it. "What is that?" His hand tightened on the tin box. The knuckles of his glove creased. "Just something I keep," he said. "That much is obvious." Silas's jaw worked once, as if he were chewing on a sentence he didn't trust. He stepped aside to let her pass, but the doorway was narrow, and she would have to brush close. Eliza hesitated. In that pause, something shifted between them. An invisible line pulled tight. Silas lowered his eyes. "You don't have to be afraid of me." The words landed wrong, not threatening, not cruel. Just tired, like he'd been accused before. Eliza lifted her chin. "I'm not afraid of you." Silas's gaze rose to meet hers, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't look away. "Then why do you keep stepping back?" he asked, quiet as a prayer. Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to say, "Because you don't want me. Because you never did. Because I couldn't stand hearing it out loud." But pride is a stubborn thing, and Eliza had worn hers for so many years it felt like skin. "I'm not stepping back," she lied. Silas's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Not quite. Something sadder. He lifted the tin box slightly, as if he might offer it, as if he might finally open it and let the truth out into the lantern light. Then footsteps sounded outside. Tilda calling her name from the house, sharp and impatient. "Eliza, where did you get off to?" Eliza flinched at the sound, instinctively clutching the jar closer. Silas's hand dropped. The tin box vanished behind his coat like it had never existed. He stepped back into the shadow. "Go on," he said. "She'll have you scrubbing pans till midnight." Eliza didn't move. The doorway held them both like a secret. "Silas," she started, and didn't know what she meant to say. His eyes softened, warmth, longing, something dangerous, then shuttered again like a door closing in a storm. "Yes," he whispered. Eliza's heart pounded so hard she feared he could hear it. Tilda's voice came again, closer now, impatient and suspicious. And Eliza did the thing she'd done for years. She backed away, not because she wanted to, because she was certain the moment she reached for him, he would pull back first. I should go," she said, and the words tasted like loss. Silas nodded once, slow. "All right." Eliza turned toward the house with the jar of peaches in her arms, the lantern bobbing, her shadow stretching long across the ground. Behind her, she felt him watching, and when she glanced back, just once, she saw Silas standing in the pantry doorway, the tin box pressed against his chest like a promise he couldn't keep. He didn't call her back. He didn't stop her. But his eyes did something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. They looked like a man watching the one thing he wanted most walk away. Again. Because he didn't know how to ask her to stay. The next morning, the ranch woke up like it always did. Quiet, dutiful, pretending nothing lived beneath the boards and dust. Eliza rose before Tilda could call for her, dressed, braided her hair, and went straight to the kitchen as if routine could pull her back into her own skin. She washed yesterday's plates twice without meaning to. When she finally stepped outside with the slop bucket for the chickens, her eyes went to the south pasture on instinct. Silas was already out there, a lone figure against the pale grass, moving slow and steady along the fence line. He didn't look up. He didn't wave. He didn't act like anything had happened in that pantry doorway. That should have eased her. Instead, it felt like being left outside a closed room with your own thoughts. At the line where the yard gave way to open range, Eliza stopped. The wind carried the smell of sun-warmed cedar and damp earth from the creek. A hawk circled high and patient, and still she stood there, fixed on a man who kept his feelings behind gloves and silence. Tilda came out with a basket of linens on her hip. "You're lingering," she said, not accusing, but not blind either. Eliza adjusted her grip on the bucket. "I'm not." Tilda's eyes narrowed, measuring. "Mr. Bragg wants you to take the account book into town, pick up flour and lamp oil, and bring back a spool of thread if Mr. Wicker has it." Eliza nodded too fast. "I can do that." "Good," Tilda said. Then, as if it were an afterthought, she added, "And don't be making a spectacle of yourself on Main Street. Hawthorne Ridge has enough hungry eyes without you feeding them." Eliza swallowed. "I won't." But even as she said it, she knew the truth. Hawthorne Ridge's eyes were already on her. By mid-morning, she was on the wagon bench with the account book tucked under her arm, the reins in her hands, and the town growing larger as the road dipped between pines. The ride should have been ordinary. Dust, ruts, a squeaking wheel that always needed grease. Today, it felt like a confession, carried in plain sight. The general store sat where it always had, boards sun-bleached, windows crowded with jars and bolts of cloth. Men stood out front talking about cattle prices and weather, as if those were the only things worth discussing. Their voices quieted when Eliza climbed down. Not completely, just enough. Mr. Wicker was behind the counter, spectacles low on his nose. He greeted her with the same polite warmth he gave anyone who paid on time. "Morning, Miss Eliza." Eliza forced a smile. "Morning." As he gathered flour and oil, she tried to focus on the list, on the coins, on anything that wasn't the feeling that the town had shifted around her. A woman nearby, Mrs. Lark, with her sharp chin and sharper curiosity, leaned over a barrel of nails and said, almost too softly to be called speaking, "I saw him with that tin box again." Eliza's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. Another woman murmured back, "He's got secrets." "A man like that always does." Eliza didn't turn. She didn't ask who they meant. She didn't have to. Mr. Wicker cleared his throat, uneasy. "Folks talk when the days get long." Eliza kept her gaze on the ledger. "They talk when the days are short, too." "Mr." Wicker hesitated, then slid the spool of thread toward her. "For what it's worth," he said, lowering his voice, "I've never seen Silas Harrington take what wasn't his." Eliza looked up, startled. Mr. Wicker's expression softened, almost fatherly. "Some men arrive in town looking for a fresh start. Others arrive running from something. Doesn't always mean they're bad." Eliza's throat went dry. "Do you know what he's running from?" Mr. Wicker shook his head. "I know what people think. That's not the same as knowing." Eliza gathered her goods and paid. She told herself she was leaving because she'd finished her errands, not because her cheeks burned. Outside, as she loaded the wagon, someone stepped into her path. It was Wade Mercer, well-dressed for a man who didn't do honest work, boots too polished, grin too confident. He'd grown up in Hawthorne Ridge and never let anyone forget it. His family owned land near the ridge line and acted like that gave them ownership of other people's lives, too. "Eliza," Wade said, as if the name belonged to him. She kept her hands on the sacks. "Wade." He leaned a shoulder against her wagon wheel. "Heard you've been spending time around that new hand." Eliza's spine went stiff. "Silas has been here years." Wade's grin didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Years, sure. Still feels new. Still feels like trouble. Folks don't like men they can't place." Eliza lifted a sack higher than she needed to, just to have something to do. "Folks can mind their own business." Wade laughed softly. "You always were stubborn." Eliza didn't respond. Wade's voice dropped. "I'm trying to spare you embarrassment. A man who keeps a tin box like it's his heart? That's not normal." Eliza finally looked at him. "And you're an expert on normal?" His smile faltered for half a second, then returned as if pasted on. "I'm an expert on this town. I know how it decides things, and once it decides, it doesn't loosen its grip." Eliza's hands trembled, small and furious. "Move!" Wade stepped aside with a shallow bow, amused. "If you ever get tired of chasing a shadow, you know where I'll be." Eliza climbed onto the bench without answering, snapped the reins, and drove out of town with her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Halfway back to the ranch, she saw a rider coming the other way. Silas. He was on a bay horse, sitting easy in the saddle, hat brim low. When he drew close, he slowed, as if he'd been searching for her on purpose. Eliza's heart stumbled. He rode alongside the wagon for a few yards, matching her pace. His gaze flicked to the sacks and jars. "You went into town." It was on the list. He nodded, eyes forward. "Did anyone bother you?" Eliza's breath caught. She wanted to say no, to protect herself from the possibility that he cared. But the truth rose in her anyway. "People were talking." Silas's mouth tightened. "About me." Eliza didn't answer, which was answer enough. Silas's hands shifted on the reins. Even gloved, his knuckles whitened. "I'm sorry." The apology felt wrong. Too heavy. Too practiced. Eliza looked at him. Really looked. Why are you apologizing? You didn't make them. Silas's gaze stayed on the road. I still brought it here. Eliza's voice came out smaller than she intended. What did you bring here, Silas? For the first time, he flinched at his own name on her tongue. He didn't speak for a long stretch, just rode beside her while the wagon wheels creaked and the pines whispered overhead. Then he said quietly, I've been meaning to tell you something. Eliza's stomach turned over, hot and cold at once. About the tin box? Silas's jaw flexed. About me. The road dipped, and for a moment the ranch house came into view. A pale shape beyond the trees, smoke curling from the chimney like a thin thread. Eliza's fingers tightened on the reins. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Silas shook his head once. That's the thing. I do want to. I just never found the right way. Eliza's pulse thudded in her ears. She tried to keep her voice steady. You could start with the easy part. Silas glanced at her, and in that look there was something like relief mixed with fear, like a man standing on the edge of a bridge he'd built himself. The tin box, he said, is proof. Proof of what? Silas swallowed. The movement was visible even under the quiet mask he wore. Proof I'm not who this town thinks I am. Eliza's throat tightened. And who does it think you are? A drifter with a past, he said. A man hiding money, or a warrant, or a stolen thing. Eliza nearly laughed, but it came out as a breath. And what are you? Silas didn't answer right away. He kept riding, eyes fixed on the ranch house. Then, as if forcing the words through, he said, a man who made a promise years ago and hasn't known how to keep it without ruining everything. Eliza's hands went damp on the leather reins. Silas's voice dropped lower. There's a letter in that box, a paper that says my name and where I'm from. A paper that could make some people here treat me different. Eliza's thoughts raced. Why would it? Silas's gaze flicked toward the ridgeline where the Mercer land began, distant and green. Because some names don't get to be ordinary. Eliza stared at him. Silas. He looked at her then, really looked, and the careful distance he always kept slipped just enough for something raw to show through. I've wanted to tell you for a long time, he said. But every time I tried, I thought... He stopped, breath catching. I thought you'd step back again. Eliza's chest tightened. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Silas's voice softened, and it wasn't just gentle now. It was honest. You don't look at me like you want me near. You look at me like you're bracing. Eliza's throat burned. That's not... Silas lifted a gloved hand, stopping her, not harshly. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying, I can't read you, and it scares me more than any rumor. Eliza's eyes stung, but she blinked it away hard. The ranch house was close now. The yard, the corrals, the smoke, all of it waiting like a witness. Silas slowed his horse. Tonight, he said, voice rougher. After supper, meet me by the old cottonwood down by the creek. Eliza's heart lurched. Why? Silas's gaze held hers, steady and bright with something he couldn't hide anymore. Because I'll bring the tin box, he said, and I'll open it, and I'll tell you what I should have told you years ago, if you'll let me. Eliza's breath caught. Every sensible part of her wanted to say no, to keep the protective distance she'd lived behind for so long. But her voice betrayed her. All right. Silas exhaled, a sound like he'd been holding his breath for years. Then he nodded once and rode on toward the south pasture, as if he hadn't just shifted the ground beneath her feet. That night, Eliza moved through supper with a strange calm, like the world had gone quiet before a storm. Tilda talked about the pantry shelves. Mr. Bragg complained about a missing hammer. Eliza smiled when she was expected to, and kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. When the dishes were cleared, She waited until Tilda had gone to check the back porch, and Mr. Bragg had settled into his chair with the newspaper. Then Eliza slipped out. The night air was cool enough to raise bumps on her arms. She followed the path toward the creek, the dark shapes of trees crowding close. The cottonwood stood where it always had, wide and patient, its branches rustling as if whispering warnings. Silas was already there. He stood under the tree with the tin box in both hands, his hat off, hair slightly mussed. Without the hat's shadow, his face looked younger and more tired. Eliza stopped a few steps away. Silas didn't move at first. He just watched her the way a man watches the one door that could open or close his whole life. "You came," he said. Eliza's voice barely worked. "I said I would." Silas nodded and looked down at the box. His gloved fingers traced the edge like he was steadying himself. "I'm going to show you," he said. "And once I do, you might look at me different." Eliza took a careful breath. "I don't want rumors deciding things for Bobs or me," Mirachua swallowed. "Neither do I." He set the tin box on a flat stone at the cottonwood's base. The night insects hummed. The creek murmured. Hawthorne Ridge felt far away, but Eliza could still feel its eyes in the dark. Silas lifted the lid. Inside, folded papers sat neat and protected, along with a small object wrapped in cloth. Eliza leaned forward despite herself. Silas reached in and drew out the first paper, his hand shaking just slightly. Then a voice cut through the night from the brush beyond the creek. Smooth, amused, and far too close. "Well," Wade Mercer said, stepping into the moonlight. "Would you look at that?" Silas's head snapped up. Eliza's stomach dropped. Wade's grin widened as his eyes landed on the open tin box. "Seems I was right to be curious," he said. "Go on, Harrington. Let's hear what name you're really hiding." Wade Mercer's boot stopped at the edge of the creek bank, his smile bright in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He looked from the open tin box to Eliza, then to Silas, like he'd finally found a loose thread he could pull. Silas didn't slam the lid. He didn't lunge or bark. He simply placed his palm over the papers, steadying them against the night breeze, and said, "This doesn't concern you." Wade chuckled. "Everything in Hawthorne Ridge concerns me, if it threatens to embarrass the town." Eliza felt her pulse in her throat. She stepped closer to the stone, putting herself beside the box instead of behind Silas. "You followed me," she said. "I kept an eye on what matters," Wade replied, and his gaze slid to Silas again. "Go on. Tell us your real name." Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "My name is Silas Harrington." Wade tilted his head. "That's what you've been calling yourself." Silas lifted the paper slowly, holding it so Eliza could see first. In the moonlight, the handwriting looked careful, official. "It's the name my mother gave me," he said, "and it's the name on these papers, whether this town likes it or not." Wade took a half step forward, eager. Eliza's hand rose before she thought about it, not to touch Wade, just to mark a boundary. "Enough," she said. Wade's eyebrows lifted. "You're defending him now?" Eliza surprised herself with how steady her voice came out. "I'm choosing not to be pushed around." Silas glanced at her, and something quiet shifted in his expression, like a man seeing water after a long drought. Wade's smile thinned. "Fine. Read it out loud then. Let the night hear it." Silas looked down at the letter again. "These aren't for the night," he said. "They're for daylight, for Mr. Bragg, for the county office in the next town over. Proper channels." Wade scoffed. "Afraid?" Silas finally met his eyes. "Tired," he said simply. "Tired of men who think volume makes them right." Wade's face hardened. You come here with papers and secrets. And you come here with pride, Eliza cut in. I've known you since we were children, Wade. You've never cared what was true, only what made you feel important. The words hung in the air like a bell struck clean. For a moment, Wade looked as if he might argue, but the creek kept murmuring, and the cottonwood kept swaying, indifferent to his standing. He glanced once more at the papers, then backed into the dark with a muttered, "This isn't finished." When he was gone, the night felt larger. Silas exhaled slowly and folded the letter back with careful hands. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking up. "I didn't want you dragged into it." Eliza's throat tightened. "You keep saying that," she whispered, "like being near you is some kind of punishment." Silas's hands stilled. "It isn't," he said. Then, quieter, "It's what I want most. That's why I've been so careful." Eliza stared at him, all the years of watching and misreading stacking up behind her eyes. "Careful?" she repeated, a little broken. "I thought you were keeping away because you couldn't." Silas stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the fear he'd been carrying. "Eliza," he said, and her name sounded like truth in his mouth. "I kept away because every time I looked at you, I wanted to reach for you, and I didn't think I had the right." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because I wanted you before I had anything to offer," he said, "and because I was certain you'd already decided I wasn't wanted." Eliza let out a small, disbelieving laugh that turned into a shaky breath. "Silas, I've been refusing a hope I didn't think I was allowed to have." He didn't touch her right away. He waited, as if giving her one last chance to step back. Eliza stepped forward instead. When his arms came around her, it was careful at first. Then it became the kind of hold that felt like coming home. She pressed her forehead to his chest, listening to his heart, startled to find it racing like her own. "I'm here," she whispered. Silas's voice roughened. "So am I." By spring, the rumors had nowhere left to stand. Papers got filed. Truths got spoken in daylight the way Silas promised. Wade Mercer learned that a town's respect can't be demanded forever. And one Sunday, under a sky so bright it made Eliza squint, Silas stood beside her on the church steps, with a plain band on his finger, and relief in his smile. A year later, the cottonwood by the creek threw shade over a small blanket in the grass, and Eliza rocked a sleeping baby while Silas mended a bridle nearby. Still quiet, still steady, but no longer a question. He looked over at her then, no distance left in him at all, and Eliza finally understood how badly they'd both been wanting the same simple thing.